All right, so we're gonna get started. Today our guest speaker is Sarah, and she's a CS PhD student at the Interactive School of Computing at Georgia Tech. Her interests are at the intersection of machine learning and NLP, and she's particularly interested in model robustness and interpretability. So let's welcome Sarah.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about some of my work in NLP interpretability, as Emily mentioned, particularly what are we looking for and where do we stand. As Emily mentioned, a brief bit of background about myself. So I'm in the third year of my PhD back, and I originally started out kind of interested in clinical NLP, and then over time my interests have shifted a bit towards explainable AI, but still centered around NLP deep learning applications. So I broadly characterize my research as fitting at the intersection of this Venn diagram of deep learning NLP and then human-centered AI, which encapsulates interpretability and explainability as well. Okay, so a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today in the talk. I'll start off with a clinical application as kind of a foray into explainability, and then talk about how we define explanation in NLP and contributing to the popular current debate on is attention explanation. And then in the third part of the talk, I'll talk about guaranteeing certain types of explainability, like faithfulness, as well as testing plausibility with human explanations, and I'll briefly touch on future directions as well. All right, so foray into explainability. Back in 2018, I was working with some clinical collaborators, and we were working on a task called, So a brief background on classification models in NLP. I'm sure most of us are familiar, but standard procedure is kind of to have a sequence of word tokens, and then in a binary classification task, which I'll mostly be discussing in this talk, the goal is to predict some output label. And so with neural classification models, we have a stack of layers representing a large amount of contextualization that can be trained end to end. So typically, this is convolution, recurrence, or even self-attention and transformer architectures. In this talk, I'll be focusing on convolution and recurrence primarily. And then a lot of state-of-the-art models also apply attention mechanisms as a means to produce a document level of vector representation of an input. And so the type of explainability that I'll be talking about in this talk is primarily centered around attention mechanisms, essentially trying to answer this question, what do existing model components give us? And so additionally, given attention weights, it's very common in NLP as well as computer vision to use them to produce a heat map on inputs. So you will typically see heat map where the implicit assumption that's often given is that high weights on certain parts of the image or text indicate that those were the most correlated with the output prediction. And this is the type of explanation that I'm mostly going to be focusing on, which is the attention kind of heat map style explanation. So as I mentioned before, back in 2018, I was working on this clinical coding task, which is popular clinical NLP. So a bit of background, often when you visit a healthcare provider, the majority of the information about your visit is encoded in free text clinical notes. So the provider is writing a summary of what occurred during the visit. And then typically what happens is human annotators manually annotate these visits with a large set of structured data codes, which are then sent for billing and insurance purposes. But this requires a large amount of skill, so they usually have about 2 years of college experience, as well as like standardized certification exams. And so this is actually quite a difficult task in the sense that the prediction space includes about 13,000 possible codes that can occur in any combination. So it's a massively multi-label classification task, as we would call it. Here's a quick example of what the data might look like. So we have these de-identified structured clinical notes from patient ICU discharge summaries. They're very long, so they're about 1,500 tokens on average, or about 1.5 pages of free text. And then on average, they have about 16 of these codes out of that 13,000 possible code subspace. So our motivation when we were designing an architecture for this task, we had this hypothesis that there would be short relevant snippets of text within the clinical note to indicate the presence of specific labels. So for example, the phrase "if all at home" would indicate a home accident. The phrase "chronic subdural hematoma" indicates something very different. So we wanted to use attention to kind of highlight these relevant parts of the input. So I'll briefly touch on the architecture. So we coined our architecture CAML, which stands for convolution and attention for multi-label classification. But the key idea of this architecture is that we're applying a per-label attention mechanism. So for each of the 13,000 codes, we have a set of parameters that we use to compute attention over the document. So we can produce a per-label document representation and then treat this as a set of 13,000 binary classification decisions. And at the time, in 2018, we achieved state-of-the-art on this ICD-9 clinical coding task. But we also wanted to externally validate our model with physician evaluation. And so we figured that we could extract the top case snippets based on our per-label attention mechanisms and present those to a physician for evaluation of their credibility of what the model was learning. And what we found is that our model, CAML on the far right, produced more highly informative and comparatively many informative snippets of text for different labels as judged by a physician, closely rivaled by a cosine similarity baseline, but significantly better than other neural classification models.
Does the informative include the highly informative, or are those?
No, those are two separate criteria. So this was nice because it validated that our model gave some plausible explanation of what's happening, and the physician liked these attention snippets. However, as I was thinking about this work more, I started to consider the question of, were those extracted snippets really the most responsible for the model's prediction? Could we guarantee that that was really the decision-making process that had occurred? And that these might be two distinct ideas of explainability. We want to build physician trust when we're building these clinical decision support tools, but we also want to be able to validate models in the case of bizarre behavior or learning spurious correlations or something of that sort. And particularly in designing this architecture, we hadn't considered contextualization. If you remember the heat map example, so essentially, attention weights are learned on highly contextualized representations, but then they're applied to word-level representations. So a lot of contextualization is happening in the inner layers of the model that we hadn't accounted for. We also hadn't accounted for model variance, like how much would these extracted snippets change with different random seeds, or exclusivity of the prediction. Would very similar models produce very different explanations for why they came to that conclusion? And then additionally, there's been a line of work kind of investigating this exact question. In early 2019, can attention weights actually provide explanation? So the first, which comes from Jane and Wallace at Northeastern, called Attention is Not Explanation, they proposed the criteria that an explanation needs to be exclusive. And then Serrano and Smith at UW looked at attention interpretability in the same setting, and they proposed that the explanations need to be robust to perturbations. And both of these papers were also looking at kind of this heat map scenario of attention weights in classification tasks for neural NLP. Which brings me to the second part of my talk, which is how do we define explanation? Like I mentioned in the clinical physician study, we really kind of found that there were really two types of explanation. And how can we characterize those, and what were these prior papers actually talking about? So this is work my colleague Yuval Pinter from earlier in 2019. So the first thing that we argued in our paper is that we should characterize based on prior work two types of explainability, plausible and faithful. And it's quite important to distinguish between the two types when you are performing these types of investigations. So plausible explainability, there's a lot of work in the HCI literature. This is essentially focused on building human trust with the system. We want to generate rationales that humans enjoy, that they understand, and that make intuitive sense to them. So this type of explainability relies very heavily on human evaluations. And faithful explainability is perhaps a bit more of a difficult criteria to achieve because it relies on interpretability more or less. We want to understand that correlation between the inputs and the output. So it's a bit more difficult in the sense that we really are focused on model understanding here. And under this criteria, we argue that the exclusivity requisite originally proposed by Jane and Wallace is quite valid when you're searching for faithful explainability. And you can motivate this by thinking about if you consider a converged model to represent a reasoning agent, and then you have an explanation mechanism. So given a set of inputs and an output, your converged model will produce one. Given a set of inputs, it will produce one output prediction. So a given explanation mechanism should produce one explanation for why that reasoning process occurred. And that's what we would consider faithful, if that explanation truly reflects that decision-making process. So in our paper from EMLP, we were focused on faithful explainability specifically. And again, we argue that these previous papers were also focused on the same question. And so these are the criteria that they established for faithful explanation particularly. Which brings me to this second part of the talk, which is attention faithful explanation? In our paper, attention is not explanation. We proposed a few criteria to actually test this a bit more rigorously. We proposed the following criteria, and then we designed a subsequent experiment for each of them, which I'll be discussing in the next few slides. So the first criteria is that attention should be a necessary component for good performance. The motivation behind this is that if you can remove the attention mechanism and you still achieve very good performance, then who's to say that those values in your model have actually converged to a meaningful representation that can be used in any downstream analysis? The second criteria is that they should be hard to manipulate, and this comes from the exclusivity requisite. So if we have two trained models that can vary their attention distributions quite a lot, but give very similar predictions, and that certainly causes pause to the exclusivity requisite in the sense that they should share very similar reasoning processes, and if our attention mechanism truly captures that, then we should see very similar attention distributions. And finally, we wanted to test them out of context. If you remember, I briefly spoke about contextualization a few slides ago. And so we wanted to test attention weights in uncontextualized settings to see how well they actually hold that one-to-one relationship between the input tokens and the output prediction. So for the first criteria, we designed a simple experiment to focus on selecting meaningful tasks. And again, in this paper, we focused on recurrent architectures with a simple additive attention layer. But this can be and has, I believe, been extended to self-attention architectures as well. And so we simply took the attention parameters or the attention scores and replaced them with a uniform distribution. And this is frozen during training. So the idea is that if this model can replicate the performance, then we've demonstrated that the attention weights or the extra parameters provided by the attention mechanism aren't necessarily necessary. And so what we find is the following, and these are a set of binary classification tasks that were used in prior work. And what we see is that, especially for the two data sets on the far right, which were news categorization data sets, we barely see any drop in performance by freezing the attention mechanism, which indicates that any subsequent analysis on these tasks is perhaps not as validated. So in our paper, we decided to focus on the 4 tests where we do see a significant drop in performance by this first set of experiments. And you'll notice the SST, which is standard sentiment tree data set of binary classification for sentiment, is quite borderline, which we'll come back to in the subsequent analysis.
Sorry.
Yes.
Explain, do you have any information on why on those 2 data sets, just setting the attention weights to uniform didn't result in a big drop? Is it just artifact task? Is it really not important to use attention for those data sets?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the difficulty of the task. So some of these tasks, I think, were designed in a pre-neural era where like just a simple LSTM baseline can perform quite well. So the addition of attention isn't necessarily contributing something that hasn't already been learned by the recurrence in the model. For our second set of experiments, which was the adversarial search, we wanted to focus again on trained models. So we differ here from prior work. Prior work focused on a post-hoc manipulation on an instance level basis. But we wanted to see whether trained models actually existed that would demonstrate the existence of these adversarial distributions. I'll briefly introduce a couple of metrics that we used, which come from prior work. So we used total variation distance to simply capture the difference in the class predictions between 2 models. So in the graph on the right, if those points represent the two models, then we're just simply summing the red distances between the points. And then to capture the difference between the attention distributions, we use Jensen-Shannon divergence, which is can be viewed as somewhat of a two-sided KL, to capture how different those distributions were. In our adversarial training, we first proposed to just train a base model, which is the simple LSTM with the added attention layer on the classification task. And then we want to train an adversary that minimizes the change in the prediction scores from the base model, which is indicated by the first term here, the total variation distance, while maximizing the changes in the learned attention distributions, which is indicated by the second KL term, the negative KL term, in this loss function. And then, of course, these are competing objectives in some sense, so we added a lambda parameter to control the trade-off. And so what we found is the following. I'll show results on a couple of different tasks. The first is a diabetes prediction task from the MIMIC3 classification clinical notes dataset. The green triangles represent quantified expected variance from random seeds. So we just ran the base model with a variety of random seeds. So that really left bounds the expected variance that we can achieve in our attention distributions. And then the purple dots represent kind of the curve of our adversarial models as we vary that lambda parameter. And so we kind of consider this to be like the bound on what is the divergence, or how much prediction difference do you lose as you start to diverge the attention distributions. And then the maximum Jensen-Shannon divergence is 0.69, so that would be like the right bound on the graph. And what we see is when we focus on the left bounded portion of our graph, we can see on this data set that as you start to diverge those attention distributions, you really start to lose your prediction difference power, which is indication in this case that they actually are good for faithful explanation, because we don't want them to be easily manipulable. However, on other tasks, such as Stanford Sentiment Tree Bank, we see the opposite effect, where essentially these distributions can be diverged almost up to the bound on the Jensen-Shannon divergence without losing very much prediction distance that's outside of the expected difference from the random seeds. So in this case, this should certainly provide pause against using attention as faithful explanation. Now, of course, in both of these cases, you could argue that, again, this y-axis is quite small, and also we didn't test for prediction flipping, which is something that might be interesting to see. These are the scores, but how much do they actually change the predictions of the model? And finally, we wanted to test attention weights for explanation in these uncontextualized settings that I mentioned previously. And also, given the fact that perhaps we have found these adversaries, how well do they actually perform compared to a learned LSTM? And so the way that we did this was we simply took our LSTM model and we removed the recurrence and applied an affine layer instead. And so the goal is this is kind of a non-contextualized bag of words model, and we can impose the learned attention weights from the variety, all of the different settings that we've ran, and then see, ideally, if this method can perform well on a classification task, that's indication that those attention scores do correspond to that one-to-one relation between the input tokens and the output prediction. So we are looking for high performance in this setup, and then these weights would be frozen during training. And so we're trying to test also, in the adversarial case, it is possible that all of the distribution could just be shifted one token over, right? And that would cause a high difference in the Jensen-Shannon, but it might still result in small prediction distance. But that would ideally fail in this method because it's no longer that one-to-one relationship. And what we find is a few interesting things. So the leftmost light blue bar represents using frozen uniform weights in this setting. The dark blue bar represents actually training those weights as a standard attention mechanism. And then the yellow bar represents freezing those weights to the LSTM's learned weights. So what's really interesting is that in a lot of cases, the LSTM weights actually outperform the trained weights, which is indication that the LSTM is learning something meaningful about that one-to-one relation between the input tokens and the output prediction. And finally, we see in all cases except for the anemia prediction data set that the adversaries perform significantly worse. So taken together with the previous results, this indicates that adversaries are a little bit more difficult to find than proposed in prior work, but also they don't perform nearly as well in this type of uncontextualized setting, which should certainly provide pause. Yes.
So till now, adversaries are able to do as fine if they work in contextualized setting. But when we remove this contextualized relations between stuff, they learn different ways. Now that's where they actually work a lot better.
Yeah, because ideally, if we wanted to show like adversaries exist, they should also work well in this setting as well, is what we were arguing, because we are looking for heat map style attention. And so again, we kind of showed that the existence of adversaries, how easy they are to find, is dataset dependent, and then also has to be tested in this setting, which is also dataset dependent as well. So to conclude this question, in our paper, we propose that there really is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question of is attention explanation. So we propose 3 desiderata of attention for faithful explanation. It should be necessary in the architecture, it should be hard to manipulate with adversaries, and it should work well out of context. And then we proposed 3 experiments to test those criteria. And what we found in conclusion is that task performance is highly specific, and we open sourced our code to encourage researchers to use these techniques on a variety of different tasks, maybe even expanding beyond binary classification, see what conclusions can be reached for specific task settings. So that concludes the second part of my talk. I'll stop here if there are any questions, just because that was a lot, or I can continue on. So we talked about defining a faithful explanation, and we talked about is attention explanation. But under this criteria of faithfulness, we started to investigate a question of how do we actually guarantee it, and then also how can we test plausibility, which is the flip side of the coin. So in current work under review with collaborators, Dr. Jane and Byron Wallace at Northeastern, we propose to guarantee faithfulness by construction via a simple architecture pipeline, which I'll describe here. So a bit of background in this section, we're again focused on explanation as an extractive subset selection problem. So this would be the equivalence of taking an attention heat map and extracting the top k tokens or the top span of tokens to represent a rationale taken from the document itself. So in a 2016 paper, some NLP researchers at MIT proposed to jointly train 2 models to do this task, a rationale generation model and then a task prediction model. Because this token selection, subset selection task is discrete, they used a reinforced style training objective, which is prone to high variance and necessitates careful hyperparameter tuning. So in practice, it's a bit difficult to adopt. However, we argue that this type of architecture does guarantee faithfulness because you are constraining the inputs that a task prediction module will see. And I'll show an example of this in the next slide. So this was the model proposed by Lei et al. So they, given a rationale such as the movie, or given a document such as the movie was good, they have a generator model that produces a probability distribution over these binary rationales. And then once you've sampled a rationale from this probability distribution, you train a classifier to predict the label simply from the rationale. So this classifier model has never seen the entire input document. It has only seen the rationale that was sampled from this probability distribution. And then to train this, they're minimizing the expected cost, where the cost function is both a function of how well you're predicting the labels, as well as some constraints on rationale length and coherence of the rationale as well. So this is trained with a doubly stochastic gradient as an approximation to the expected cost gradient, which again is a bit sensitive to hyperparameters and quite difficult to train. So in our recent work under submission, we're proposing a simpler architecture to do kind of the same thing. And we coin our model fresh. So we start with a basic support model, which is simply a classifier. So this can have arbitrary complexity, which is an advantage of this method. And then we don't use the support model for anything else besides extracting feature importance scores. And these can take any form. So any feature importance metric could be used in this architecture, which is another advantage. It's a bit more general than that proposed in Lay et al. And then we have an extractor model, which can be trained or heuristic, that simply uses the feature to produce a rationale. So this could be as simple as taking the top k tokens, taking the maximum length contiguous span, or it could be trained using some signal from human gold label rationales or something of that nature, all of which we test in the paper, but for simplicity, we'll stick with the heuristic models here as they do perform as well in our initial experiments. And then we pass the rationale to our classifier model, which predicts the label. So this is very similar to that in Lay et al. But the difference here is that we don't actually train end-to-end. So this is a pipeline. So the dotted lines indicate no gradient flow. And so what we want to do is we want our classifier model to be able to replicate the performance of the support model. And also the guarantee of faithfulness here is that the classifier model has only seen the rationale. So by construction, rationale presents a subset of the original document, or sorry, the subset presents a rationale of the original document that can be used for prediction. And so we are limited to extractive subset selection rationales in this case, but we argue that this is a quite simple and flexible approach where these support and classifier and extractor can be of arbitrary complexity, considering a lot of work in interpretability has focused on simplifying architectures. And then given a trained model, the extractor can be quite simple, and then training classifier is quite simple as well. And so again, this is the final rationale that we would be selecting from this architecture. Sure.
So when you use the classifier model, are you also using the weights of the rationale words, like the numbers of the?
No.
No, only the individual.
So it's just the rationale.
Just a set of counts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And is this able to extend for like have a phrase as a rationale, like maybe 2 words or 3 words as a single phrase?
Yeah. So I mean, it could be contiguous or non-contiguous, where contiguous is a phrase and then non-contiguous would be like a set of words. So in the previous work, they specifically focused on contiguous, which I'll show briefly in the results. But yeah, so the goal was to see not only which ones performed better, but also which ones humans prefer for plausibility. So the results of these experiments are pretty promising in the sense that we find that our pipeline architecture, which is much simpler to train, more general and less prone to variance, outperforms prior models and also recovers most of the performance of the original black box, which is here is the support model. And we do this only seeing about 10 to 30% of the original text. Additionally, we achieve better average performance than the end-to-end method while being simpler to train. And so here are some results for various rationale proportion lengths, which is, again, a hyperparameter. In our experiments, we set this based on human gold label rationales when we have them. Otherwise, we use about 20% as our base proportion. But our model is represented by the red line, and then the 2016 model is represented by the blue line. And these are, again, some binary classification data sets, Stanford Sentiment for movie review sentiment, AG News, which is a news categorization task, Evidence Inference, which is a clinical prediction task, and then movies and multi-RC as well. And so what we see is that we outperform the Lay et al. Model. Additionally, while it's not plotted on this graph, we are almost recovering the full model performance, and we have significantly less variance as well across multiple runs of the same model. Yeah, so that is a bit on how an architecture that we've proposed to guarantee faithfulness. So finally, we've talked a lot about faithfulness, and I did want to address the flip side, which is how do we test plausibility of our explanations. This is, again, in the same work. We wanted to design human evaluations to test for plausibility. So again, this is focused on the portion of the explainability paradigm focused on providing things that humans enjoy and that make intuitive sense to human users. So we categorize this into two categories, primarily sufficiency and coherence. So sufficiency was a criteria used in the Lay et al. Paper, where they stressed that the classifier model should be sufficient enough to reproduce the prediction, seeing only the rationale. We wanted to test this from a plausibility perspective with human users. So can a human actually perform the role of the classifier model with high accuracy? And if so, that indicates that our rationales are sufficiently plausible. And then we also wanted to test coherence. While this isn't a complete social factors analysis, there's a lot more work on that in the HCI community. We did want to test how readable and understandable they were, and our hypothesis was that humans would prefer the contiguous spans to uncontiguous, like token selection tasks. So we gave them the following questions. We gave them to 5 Turkers per 100 random test set annotations. And for the first task, we asked them to perform the actual task. So for movie reviews, this would be to predict the sentiment. And the key is that they only see the rationale. We additionally asked them to rate their confidence as well as the readability of the rationale to test plausibility and to give us a bit of a more fine-grained notion of sufficiency here. So again, we've just replaced human annotator pipeline of the classifier module for the human analysis portion. And so what we find is quite interesting. So humans are able to perform almost as well as the classifier model at predicting labels, which is promising for the fresh architecture because it also could be used in a use case where we have human annotators and we want to kind of simplify their annotation process by first condensing a very long input, such as a clinical note, into a rationale, a small subset of the input, and then give it to them for them to use in a annotation task. Additionally, they were able to do at least as well using our rationales as with those from prior work or random. And we also find that they do better with contiguous rationales than they do with non-contiguous, which is kind of confirming that hypothesis that they are preferred. As for readability, we observe a similar result. Our rationales are comparable in readability to other methods, and again, contiguous rationales, which are indicated by purple, are far preferred to non-contiguous rationales. And I will also point out for the actual sufficiency task, we tested this with the ground truth human rationales, which the data sets actually had for this portion. And humans can perform very, very well given only the ground truth human rationale. They can get almost 99% accuracy. And so there's still ways of improvement to go in extracting better rationales that can perform as well as like human gold standard. So what these results have confirmed is basically we can have both faithfulness and plausibility, and that they're not mutually exclusive criteria. So that concludes the talk, and I just wanted to highlight a few takeaways and future work directions. So the first takeaway from the first part is that terminology matters, and it's important to define what you're looking for. So we introduced faithfulness and plausibility as two sides of the coin. And we also highlighted that faithful explainability correlates to model understanding, which is something that people in the NLP community are definitely interested in, and that we hopefully can do a lot more of in terms of understanding the inner workings of our model. There is no one-size-fits-all answer to is attention faithful explanation rate. A lot of people have asked me what the of our paper is, and the answer is you kind of need to test it in task-specific settings, but we hope our criteria will be useful for that purpose. And then we proposed a pipeline approach as one way to guarantee faithfulness, with the caveat that we were specifically focused on subset selection explanations here. So these are abstractive explanations are another line of work, and I'm kind of curious to think about how those might be able to guarantee faithfulness, because removing that constraint on the vocabulary certainly might break some of those guarantees. And finally, through the human evaluations, we showed that faithfulness and plausibility are not mutually exclusive. So what's next? I'll quickly touch on a few future directions that I interested in, and I'm happy to discuss any of these things offline as well. So I'm personally interested in model stability and robustness. As we saw in the second part of the talk, from attention is not explanation, we can quantify expected variance, and perhaps metrics that demonstrate more variance should be less indicative of a good explanation mechanism. I'm also interested in better and more consistent human evaluation. So as I was designing the human evaluations for the third paper in the talk, I found that a lot of the literature in CV and NLP communities didn't really have a consistent way to set up a mechanical Turk study for these type of evaluations, which makes it really hard to compare against different methods if they're not asking users to perform the same type of tasks. So we motivated the sufficiency task as well as testing coherence, but I think that we could definitely refer to the HCI literature for more insights on how to design better human evaluations. I'm interested in machine learning approaches to plausibility. So I think that while faithfulness will allow us to generate model understanding, we also want models to display understanding that aligns with the notions that we want. If you think back to the physician example, ideally we would want, if we could guarantee that those explanations were faithful, we would then want them to align with the physician's known knowledge about clinical diagnoses. And so I think one direction for this might be to leverage common sense knowledge or reasoning to kind of guide models towards producing more plausible explanations that align with human common sense. And finally, I think RL is a really interesting field for explainability. So there's been a bit of work on investigating Q values as a measure of why an agent is taking the actions that it is. But I think that we could also use natural language productions of an agent to try to understand more of the experiential learning. So before a policy is converged on, there's a lot of experiential learning that happens in an RL agent. And can we somehow not throw that away, but actually use that to understand why the values are what they are and how that might, allow us to better understand the internal workings of the RL system. So, great, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank my collaborators as well as my lab mates in the computational linguistics and entertainment intelligence labs at Georgia Tech. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or reach out via email. I'm happy to talk about any of this offline as well. So, thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot for the very nice talk. I would like to discuss briefly the assumption that you're making, I believe, in this talk, that attention can, it's kind of implicit, I think, in the talk, but that attention can capture explanation. And to some extent, I can see this happening. So if you have good or if you have very explicit language, then you can connect this to your class that you're predicting, and there is very clear that these words or a phrase is indicative of a certain class. But language is very often has a lot of gaps. Things are very often very contextual. There is way too much that is just not given in language. For example, I just opened the 1970 movie reviews, and one of the reviews is the following: World War I is perhaps unequaled in its horrific brutality. 1917 takes us into that horror and doesn't let us out of it for 2 hours. So I guess, this is a positive review, but if I as a human annotator, if I have to decide what is the indication here, I would have a lot of trouble. So I was wondering, what would be the limitations, or are there some ways to let's say, conceptualize the limitations of attention for such explanations?
Yeah, I think one limitation certainly is this instance level assumption. So I think some people have started to look at explanation more from referring back to the training data. So not just looking at extracting an explanation from an instance, but where was that actually learned during the training process, which is a much more difficult question. So I think there are certainly limitations to giving explanations that are instance specific, like it has to come directly from the text. I guess we make that assumption because I guess we are assuming no background or common sense knowledge, which might be too strong of an assumption, given the training paradigm, and certainly for humans as well. But I think we have to make that assumption for now because we don't really understand how humans might classify, what is the background knowledge that they might be using to actually label that. we don't really have a way to model that currently. Is that what you were asking? I don't know if that was...
Yeah, exactly. Because actually the explainability work that I've seen before, let's say, in my previously, was from people that, let's say, have been looking into this more from a knowledge graph perspective. And there, people try to answer this in a very different way. So that's why I just wanted to bring it up and just hear what are your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that the knowledge graph approach is interesting. I think training data attribution has very promising directions as well, both for bias and fairness as well as interpretability, because I think understanding like where in the training paradigm like information was learned, especially for like sources of bias or fairness, that could be very important, which is different from the knowledge graph approach, but maybe an alternative. So thanks for the question. Yes.
So I think you try to minimize two types of errors there. There's the classification error, and then there's sort of like the explanation error, right? And from what I understand is that the magnitude and the nature of these two types of error are highly task specific.
For the second portion of or for all of them, I guess?
Yeah, and then for the medical annotation task there for the diseases, could you maybe characterize where the explanation errors occur? I mean, what type of challenges do you have? I mean, are those rare diseases? Are those unusual phrasings?
I see.
You know, would doubling the training data, you know, cut the error rate in half, or where?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we did not look at label prevalence when doing the human annotation or the human evaluation experiments on the clinical task. So I think that's a good question for sure. Certainly we looked at, model performance as a function of label prevalence. And of course, it's a lot worse for the very, very rare diseases, for example. But that's a good point and something I hadn't thought about. Mm-hmm. I think you had another question, which was about the error, or was that?
Well, was it? I mean, there's sort of like classification error is one part, but that's sort of like super generic too.
Yeah. I mean, I think for the other portions, that's why designing human experiments is so important, because we don't always have gold standard explanations, and also there isn't necessarily a gold standard explanation, perhaps, that all human annotators might agree on. So in the Tale work, they looked at the rationale plausibility quality by comparing them to gold label human explanations. But I think that we should also consider more going back to the human design factor. In the absence of those gold standard or gold labels, how can we actually better evaluate explanations on the human perspective for errors, I suppose, like errors of human understanding for the plausibility side. So.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes.
I feel like when I was reading the papers in this direction, like about explainability of NLP, I felt that most of them are talking about the explanation about the correct predictions, like finding the rationales why the model is doing correctly on this particular instance. But what about I will look at some explanations about the errors and the mistakes, the instance that you make mistake with this model. So do you have some thinking about that kind of the explanation about the mistakes of the model?
Yeah. So I think there was a good paper at EMLP this year, not my own, that talked about like the 3 different things that we can use them for, and one of them is like actually understanding model error or model mistakes. So I think, at least in our experiments, for example, like the physician one, we showed predicted labels and their rationale. It didn't matter whether it was correct or not, because the idea is like, does the rationale support the predicted label? So it is important when you do the analysis to consider, you should produce good rationales for all predictions, but potentially that could provide insight into why predictions might be false. But if you only provide the true positive instances, then I don't think you've really learned everything you could by model understanding. So the goal of model understanding is to also understand like where errors are being made, or where perhaps like the training data might not be capturing like what we hope it would, so that the model is learning what we hope it would, or maybe our architectures aren't learning what we hope they would. So I think it's important to look at the negative instances. I haven't seen papers though, or I haven't personally done an analysis specifically on
the explanations about the mistake.
Yeah. I wonder though. I assume there are. I don't know if
Yeah.
there's any. I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah,
about
I
that.
just feel a little bit weird when we are doing explanation, but we only assume that the model is always doing correctly on the instance that we gave explanations. But in reality, we know that the model can make mistake, but we didn't look very much about the explanations about the mistake. Yeah, I think that would be very interesting. And
Yeah. I think our goal with faithfulness, which we certainly aren't in a position, but like if we can guarantee faithfulness, which would be kind of the base criteria for that, then we would be able to say this is why the decision was made, and then we can actually do like any subsequent analysis. Because it's hard to say if a rationale is being produced that's just plausible, then you don't really know that might not necessarily tell you what you want, especially if it's guided by gold label human rationales. The model could be totally capable of producing a plausible rationale while doing something completely else on the prediction side, right? And so that's what we're trying to avoid, and we want to try to investigate further, because that would not emit the analysis that you would need for these types of questions. So yeah.
Any other questions? All right, then let's thank the speaker.